Yesterday's primary was the first real test of Alabama's strict new voter ID law, and we can report it disenfranchised at least one valid voter, 93-year-old Willie Mims.
When did you first vote?
My first vote way back in World War II.
Today, you didn't get a chance to vote?
No, I didn't get a chance to vote. I went down there, though. I went down there, and they told me I had to get something with my name on it.
Willie Mims doesn't drive anymore, so he doesn't need a license, and he didn't have any other form of ID. Not that there's anything wrong with that. According to reports, election officials didn't even offer him a chance to cast a provisional ballot, which is actually still required under that law. Now, Alabama originally passed this voter ID law back in 2011. It didn't go into effect until after last year's Supreme Court ruling, of course, overturning part of the Voting Rights Act. And in that ruling, the court eliminated the requirement that states with a history of discrimination have to get advance approval for changes to how people vote. That's not all. GOP politicians in Alabama say the ID law wasn't designed to make it harder to vote. It was designed to combat potential voter fraud. You've heard about that before. Now, that kind of fraud ranges from rare to non-existent, a fact that was actually evident in an unusual new offer from the Alabama GOP. Look at this. The state's Republican Party announced it's offering a $1,000 reward for information that directly leads to a conviction of a felony for voter fraud. Now, if that happened a lot, that would be an expensive program for the Alabama GOP. But this new bounty raises more troubling questions about what Alabama Republicans are up to. When did this political party decide it's its job to police elections instead of trying to win elections? Joining me now is Zachary Roth, national reporter for MSNBC.com, and the Washington Post's Eugene Robinson, also an MSNBC analyst. Welcome to you both. Zachary, you've been reporting on this area. What did we learn here in Alabama yesterday?
Well, we learned that, first of all, we know for a fact the law disenfranchises valid voters. You just showed the video of Willie Mims saying, "I couldn't vote." We also learned that the Alabama GOP is intent on rooting out some kind of voter fraud that they believe they can find. They offered a $1,000 reward, so this is a pretty good test. So far, it doesn't sound like they've come up with too much. To be fair, I actually checked back with them today. They said there was a couple of incidents, two of which it sounded like could potentially have been stopped by voter ID that they were going to look into a little bit more. Absolutely no confirmation that these were organized fraud in any way. They're going to look some more and release the results. If the past is anything to go by, it's very unlikely that this would lead to any voter fraud convictions that they're looking for. Even prosecutions is very unlikely.
Right. And Eugene, you look at the video of Mr. Mims, and if you're a fair-minded person or you just believe in democracy, it is angering. It doesn't feel like there's any reason this individual should be prevented from voting. Please put that in context for us with this bounty, which I find very suspect.
Well, first of all, when you look at that video of Mr. Mims, it makes you think it's not 2014. It makes you think it's about 1952 or something like that. I mean, you know, this looks like the old Alabama from that film. Now, you know, for all I know, there might have been a Caucasian voter or two who was also disenfranchised yesterday, and maybe that sort of news will come out in the days to come. But I think we have a pretty good idea of what the intent of this law is, and this bounty offer is just ludicrous. It just goes once again to prove that all this voter ID is ostensibly to solve a problem that does not exist, that you can't find if you pay to find it, and they're not going to find it. These 4 incidents, if all they can find is 4 incidents that they say might look like voter fraud, I can pretty much guarantee that they're going to all disappear. I think I would guarantee $1,000 if any of those actually ends up as a conviction.
Right, and we looked at this. There's different ways to count it, but in one analysis by the News 21 group, you basically have, out of 146 million registered voters, 10 to 15, about 10 cases of this, which comes out to 1 out of every 15 million prospective voters. That's a lot of zeros, Zach, after the decimal point to show how rarely this happens. And yet, when you look at Alabama, they're getting away with it so far. But in the courts, the question is whether they had a discriminatory intent with these laws, a point that Gene was alluding to.
That's right, and especially now under the Voting Rights Act in its more weakened form since last summer, it's more difficult to get these laws struck down. One interesting point about this law, you said it was enacted in 2011 but hadn't gone into effect until after the Shelby County decision. That's because Alabama itself did not try to get the law approved. So they knew essentially that it was going to have a discriminatory impact and wasn't going to withstand the Voting Rights Act.
Right, and Gene, the reason they needed the so-called, what the lawyers call pre-clearance, basically the permission slip in advance, is because they had systematically discriminated by race for so long that they were in that category. And whenever I talk about the Voting Rights Act, it's important to remind people most states are not in that category. It is not necessarily a presumption of oversight for everyone. It is looking at the places where the discrimination has occurred.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And one thing that's also important to remember, though, Ari, is that it wasn't that the entire Voting Rights Act was thrown out. I guess I should say yet, but it wasn't all thrown out. And so what the Supreme Court has done is imposed a much higher burden on the Justice Department. Rather than have to seek pre-clearance for these sorts of changes, states that are covered or that were covered under the old map can go ahead and impose them. But the Justice Department can still investigate and can see if there is discriminatory impact. And I have no doubt that under Eric Holder, the Justice Department will indeed look at the impact of this law. It's just a shame that it has to be after the fact, and it's a shame that people do have to be disenfranchised if indeed the law is ultimately found to be discriminatory.
Yeah, and Zach, the last thing I want to touch on is there was this study where they actually had researchers impersonate voters contacting legislators. You wrote about this. What happened there? What did that seem to demonstrate?
Well, it was a pretty ingenious study, actually, because they had some emails that were sent coming from Jacob Smith and others from, I think it was Santiago Rodriguez. And they found that among legislators who supported voter ID, they were much less likely to respond to the emails. And this was a question, an email asking a question about voting. They're much less likely to respond to Santiago Rodriguez than to Jacob Smith. So the reason that's important is a lot of these cases that are challenging voter ID laws and other voting restrictions hinge on being able to prove that discriminatory intent. So in these cases, the plaintiffs are looking for emails that show evidence of racial bias and so on. If you could show that kind of pattern of not responding to voters who are Hispanic or who are black at the rate that you're responding to white voters, that's all evidence that would be taken into account to show that kind of discriminatory intent, and that's what the lawyers are looking to show.
Yeah, and that really goes to why these laws exist and whether you need to patrol them, or as Gene was mentioning, use the rest of the Voting Rights Act as the DOJ is trying to do. Zach Roth and Gene Robinson, thank you both for joining me tonight.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate it.